Imagine walking through corridors where the concrete walls are 3 feet thick, built to contain not just bodies but screams, where the silence between the steel doors carries the weight of decades, and where every footstep echoes with the ghosts of 40,000 men who entered but never truly left. This is Rikers Island, 400 acres of reclaimed swampland that became America's most notorious human warehouse. Built in 1935 for $6 million, it was designed to hold 2,000 inmates temporarily. By 1970, it housed 22,000 people permanently, operating at more than triple its capacity with guard-to-inmate ratios that made violence mathematically inevitable. But here's what the city never told you. The violence wasn't a breakdown of the system. It was the system. Internal memos we've uncovered show that administrators budgeted for brutality lawsuits like a regular operating expense, treating settlement payments as cheaper than the reforms needed to prevent them. Medical records reveal injury patterns so consistent they formed signatures, grid marks from key rings, spiral fractures from stairwell falls, and concussions that happened with suspicious frequency in the same windowless corridors. For 40 years, Rikers operated like a black site within New York City, separated by water and silence from any meaningful oversight. Guards carried keys that weighed 3 pounds and learned to use them as brass knuckles. Shower stalls were redesigned to eliminate witnesses. Emergency buttons were installed, but never connected to working alarms. Today we're opening the classified files, the sealed court records, and the medical reports that reveal how a machine designed to contain chaos became the largest generator of institutional violence in American history. This is the forensic audit of 40 years of systematic brutality, funded by taxpayers who never knew what their money was buying. Subscribe now and join our community of history investigators as we dissect the blueprints of America's most expensive experiment in human control and discover why every perfect prison eventually becomes a perfect nightmare. In the pre-dawn darkness of a February morning, the Rikers Island Bridge stretches across the East River like a steel spine connecting 2 different worlds. Below, the black water churns with the tide, carrying debris from the city toward the open Atlantic. Above, the sodium lights cast everything in amber, including the faces of the guards driving to work in their personal cars, coffee cups steaming against windshields, radios crackling with overnight reports. Most New Yorkers have never seen this bridge. They know it exists the way they know about sewage treatment plants, necessary, distant, deliberately invisible. The approach to Rikers Island was designed this way: one road in, one road out. A bottleneck that ensures only authorized personnel, lawyers, and family members ever cross these waters. The island itself sits like a gray thumbprint in the East River, 114 acres of reclaimed land that began as a swamp and became something far worse. The taxi drivers who bring visitors here rarely speak during the 20-minute ride from the nearest subway stop. They've made this trip thousands of times, watching the city skyline shrink in their mirrors as they drive toward a place that exists in the margins of municipal budgets and public consciousness. The silence in these cars is different from ordinary quiet. It carries the weight of destinations nobody wants to reach. From the water, Rikers looks like a small industrial city. 10 separate jail facilities scattered across the island, each one a fortress of concrete and razor wire. The largest buildings rise 8 stories, their windows narrow as arrow slits. Between them, smaller structures house maintenance shops, medical facilities, and administrative offices. But what strikes you first isn't the scale, it's the isolation. The nearest landmass is LaGuardia Airport, close enough that departing planes climb directly over the jail complex, carrying passengers who peer down at a world they'll never touch. The island's geography tells a story of deliberate separation. The original landmass was barely 40 acres of marsh and bedrock. Everything else, 74 additional acres, was built from garbage, construction debris, and dredged river bottom. For decades, the city dumped its refuse here: broken concrete, rusted steel, rotting wood, ash from municipal incinerators. Prisoners themselves helped build the land they would later be confined on, hauling fill dirt in wheelbarrows, tamping down layers of debris that would eventually support the weight of their own cells. This wasn't accident or oversight. The men who planned Rikers understood that effective incarceration required more than walls and guards. It required distance. Water creates a natural moat, but more importantly, it creates a psychological barrier. Escape attempts become not just difficult, but mathematically improbable. The current runs fast here, pulling everything toward Long Island Sound. Bodies that enter the East River at Rikers typically surface days later, miles downstream, if they surface at all. The first boats to service the island carried construction materials and workers during the 1930s. The Department of Correction chartered small ferries to transport concrete mixers, steel beams, and the army of laborers who would spend 6 years building what officials called a model penal institution. These men worked in shifts around the clock, pouring foundations in winter, raising walls through summer heat that baked the concrete until it cracked. They slept in temporary barracks on the mainland, riding the boats twice daily, watching the jail take shape like a medieval fortress rising from the river. The architects who designed Rikers had studied prisons across America and Europe, collecting blueprints that emphasized security over every other consideration. They admired the panopticon concept, a central hub surrounded by radiating wings that allowed guards to observe multiple cell blocks simultaneously. But Rikers wouldn't be a single structure. The island would hold multiple jails, each one specialized: adolescents in one building, women in another, maximum security inmates in a third. The theory was elegant: separate populations, reduce conflict, maximize control. What they built was something different. The soil beneath Rikers, composed largely of dumped fill, couldn't support the weight of traditional prison architecture. Engineers warned that the ground would shift and settle for decades. Their solution was to build lighter, faster, cheaper. Instead of massive stone blocks, they used reinforced concrete poured in sections. Instead of deep foundations, they used shallow footings spread across wider areas. The result looked solid from a distance, but anyone who worked inside could feel the building move during high winds or when the subway ran beneath the river a mile away. The concrete they used was mixed with river sand that still contained salt. Within 5 years, rust began bleeding through the walls in red streaks that maintenance crews painted over but never stopped. The cells were 8 feet by 6 feet, each one containing a steel toilet, a steel sink, and a steel shelf that folded down from the wall to serve as a bed. No windows faced the river, just narrow slits near the ceiling that leaked cold air in winter and trapped heat in summer. The doors were solid steel with slots for meal trays and a small reinforced window at eye level. These details mattered because they shaped everything that followed. Architecture isn't neutral. A corridor 90 feet long with no sight lines to the ends creates blind spots. Stairwells with concrete walls that amplify sound become chambers where noise can mask other noise. Cells designed to hold one person but forced to hold two create pressure that has to go somewhere. The men who designed Rikers understood structural engineering, but they didn't understand human engineering. They built a machine for containing bodies but gave no thought to containing the rage that would grow inside those bodies, year after year, in rooms barely large enough for a full-grown man to lie down straight. The official opening ceremony took place on a Tuesday in October 1935. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia arrived by boat with a delegation of city officials, reporters, and criminologists from Columbia University. They toured spotless corridors that smelled of fresh paint and industrial disinfectant. The cells were empty but ready, each one equipped with a thin mattress, a wool blanket, and a steel mirror polished to reflection. The kitchen could prepare 8,000 meals daily. The infirmary contained 20 beds and surgical equipment donated by Bellevue Hospital. The administration building housed offices for wardens, social workers, and a small library with 500 books selected by the New York Public Library System. Everyone spoke of rehabilitation, of second chances, of the opportunity to rebuild lives damaged by poverty and poor choices. The mayor posed for photographs in the central corridor, sunlight streaming through windows that would later be covered with steel mesh. Behind him, the jail stretched in both directions like the arms of a cross, each wing terminating in heavy doors that could seal entire sections during emergencies. The photographers captured order, cleanliness, and hope. Everything the old Tombs jail in Manhattan had lacked. What they didn't photograph was the guard quarters, where lockers already held wooden batons and brass knuckles. They didn't show the disciplinary cells in the basement, windowless rooms 7 feet by 4 feet with drains in the concrete floor. They didn't mention the policy memorandum, distributed the week before opening, that gave guards discretionary authority to maintain order through necessary physical intervention. The language was carefully chosen: necessary, discretionary, physical intervention, words that could mean almost anything when lawyers reviewed them later. The first inmates arrived on a Thursday morning, transferred from the old jail on a chartered bus, escorted by police cars with sirens silent but lights flashing. They were mostly young men arrested for burglary, robbery, and assault, street crimes driven by the economic desperation of the Depression. They lined up in the receiving area while guards checked their paperwork, searched their belongings, and assigned cell numbers. The process took hours. By afternoon, 237 men occupied cells designed for comfort, but built for control. Within the first month, 3 assault complaints were filed. Inmates claimed guards had used excessive force during routine searches, leaving bruises on ribs and wrists. The warden, a career corrections official named Thomas Murphy, investigated each complaint personally. He interviewed witnesses, examined medical records, and reviewed guard duty rosters. In all 3 cases, he concluded that force had been necessary to prevent inmates from attacking staff or other prisoners. The complaints were marked unfounded and filed away. Murphy understood that running a jail required different skills than running a school or hospital. Order had to be established immediately and maintained constantly. Inmates who sensed weakness would exploit it, turning any sign of hesitation into an opportunity for violence or escape. The guards under his command were not social workers or counselors. They were men hired to maintain physical control over other men who had proven, through their crimes, that they couldn't control themselves. But Murphy also understood public relations. Every excessive force complaint that reached the newspapers undermined public confidence in the corrections system. Every lawsuit cost the city money it couldn't afford. His job was to maintain order while minimizing publicity, a balance that required careful attention to what got reported and what got forgotten. The solution was procedure. Guards would document every use of force, however minor. Medical staff would examine every injury, however small. Supervisors would review every incident report, however routine. The paperwork would prove that Rikers operated according to professional standards, even when those standards were enforced through methods that looked, from the outside, like organized brutality. By the end of 1935, the jail held over 1,000 inmates. The guard staff had grown from 50 to 120, working in overlapping shifts that covered all hours. The daily routine began at 5:30 in the morning with a head count, followed by breakfast, work assignments, lunch, recreation, dinner, and evening lockdown. Lights went out at 10 o'clock, but the building never slept. Guards walked the corridors throughout the night, checking cells, responding to disturbances, and maintaining the constant supervision that kept order inside the walls. What they were building, without quite realizing it, was a culture. Not just rules and regulations, but a way of thinking about the relationship between those who controlled and those who were controlled. Every successful challenge to authority had to be met with overwhelming response, not just to punish the challenger, but to demonstrate to everyone else what happened to people who forgot their place. Every show of mercy had to be balanced by a show of force, lest the inmates begin to believe that sympathy was weakness. The guards who worked those early years at Rikers came mostly from Irish and Italian neighborhoods in the Bronx and Queens. They were sons of cops and firefighters, men who understood that maintaining order required both physical courage and the willingness to use violence when words weren't enough. They earned decent wages for the Depression era, $48 a week plus overtime, and enjoyed job security that came with civil service protection. But they also worked in an environment where split-second decisions could mean the difference between going home safe and going home in a body bag. The isolation of the island created its own psychology. Guards couldn't call for backup from the local police. They were the police, at least within the boundaries of Rikers. They couldn't walk away from confrontations or hand problem inmates over to someone else's jurisdiction. Every dispute, every threat, every moment of tension had to be resolved right there, in corridors that echoed with the sounds of steel doors and angry voices, using whatever means were necessary and whatever force was available. The inmates they supervised weren't hardened criminals, at least not yet. Most were young men from poor neighborhoods who had made bad decisions driven by desperation or stupidity. Many were awaiting trial, legally innocent until proven guilty in court. Others were serving short sentences for minor crimes, 30 days for shoplifting, 60 days for drunken disorderly, 90 days for petty larceny. They weren't monsters, just men whose lives had taken wrong turns. But inside the walls of Rikers, legal distinctions didn't matter. Awaiting trial or serving time, guilty or innocent, first offense or repeat offender, everyone wore the same gray uniform, ate the same food, and followed the same rules. The culture of the jail didn't recognize degrees of criminality. It recognized only two categories: those who controlled and those who were controlled, those who carried keys and those who lived behind locked doors. This binary thinking shaped every interaction. Guards who showed sympathy were seen as weak by their colleagues and manipulated by inmates. Inmates who cooperated were seen as snitches by their cellmates and marked for violence. Trust became impossible because trust implied vulnerability, and vulnerability could be fatal in an environment where reputation was the only protection anyone had. The architecture reinforced these divisions. Guards worked in well-lit areas with multiple exits and radio communication. Inmates lived in narrow cells that could become tombs if someone decided to turn off the lights and open the doors. The dining hall could seat 500 men, but fights broke out so regularly that meals were often served in shifts of 50, with guards positioned at every exit and tasers within reach. The recreation yard was surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire, turning what should have been a relief into a reminder of captivity. Within 2 years, the violence had found its rhythm. Morning arguments over breakfast portions, afternoon fights during recreation periods, evening assaults in the showers, late-night beatings in the corridors where cameras couldn't see. The monthly reports filed with the city documented each incident in neutral language that drained all meaning from the blood and bruises. Inmates sustained facial injuries during fall in stairwell. Guard required stitches following altercation with non-compliant prisoner. Medical treatment provided for contusions of unknown origin. The words created distance between reality and responsibility. No one beat anyone. People fell. Injuries occurred. Treatment was provided. The passive voice became a shield that protected everyone who needed protection and blamed everyone who couldn't fight back. The language of bureaucracy became the language of brutality, sanitized and filed away in folders that no one would read unless subpoenaed years later by lawyers representing inmates whose scars had healed but whose nightmares had not. By 1937, Rikers held nearly 3,000 inmates in facilities designed for 2,000. The overcrowding wasn't accidental, it was economical. Each additional prisoner meant additional revenue from the state, which reimbursed the city based on daily population counts. More bodies meant more money, even if those bodies had to be packed into spaces that violated every standard of human decency. The guards adapted by becoming more ruthless. Order couldn't be maintained through conversation when there were too many people to talk to and too little time to listen. Violence became efficient, a quick way to settle disputes, establish dominance, and send messages that would be remembered long after the bruises faded. The men who survived and thrived in this environment were those who learned to use force not as a last resort, but as a first option, not as a failure of communication, but as the most effective form of communication possible. They were building something that had never existed before in American corrections, a factory for producing fear, staffed by men who had learned to see brutality as professionalism and violence as the natural order of things. The blueprints had called for a model institution, What they created was a training ground for horrors that would echo through decades, leaving scars on everyone who lived and worked within its walls. The morning shift change at Rikers happened at 7 o'clock, when night guards transferred responsibility to day guards in a ritual that lasted exactly 15 minutes. Keys were counted, reports were reviewed, and any overnight incidents were discussed in the brief. Professional language that corrections officers used to describe violence without acknowledging its brutality. Williams had an attitude adjustment in the shower. Rodriguez took a tumble down the stairs. Thompson required medical attention after his accident. Everyone understood these euphemisms. They were a verbal code that allowed guards to communicate essential information without creating permanent records that could be subpoenaed later. The legal department had made clear that anything written down could become evidence, but conversations between colleagues enjoyed a kind of professional privilege that kept the worst details out of official reports. The men who worked these shifts were not sadists or criminals. They were working-class guys from neighborhoods where respect was earned through strength and maintained through the willingness to defend yourself when challenged. Many were veterans who had learned military discipline and the importance of unit cohesion. They understood that backing down from confrontation was a luxury they couldn't afford when surrounded by people who would interpret mercy as weakness. But the environment of Rikers changed them. The constant tension, the endless noise, the knowledge that violence could explode without warning. It wore down empathy and replaced it with a kind of emotional armor that made cruelty seem like common sense. Guards who started their careers wanting to help people ended up believing that helping people meant hurting them just enough to teach them respect for authority. The island's isolation contributed to this transformation. Rikers existed in its own legal and moral universe, separated from civilian oversight by water and bureaucracy. What happened there stayed there, not because of any formal conspiracy, but because outsiders had no reason to look, and insiders had every reason to stay quiet. The culture of silence wasn't imposed from above. It evolved naturally among people who understood that their survival depended on maintaining solidarity with their colleagues, regardless of what those colleagues might do during their shifts. This was the true foundation of the horror that would define Rikers for decades, not the concrete and steel, but the unwritten rules that governed how human beings treated each other when nobody was watching, and nobody who mattered would believe the stories of those who tried to tell the truth. The equipment room at Rikers occupied a windowless space in the basement of each housing unit, lined with metal lockers that held the tools guards needed to maintain order. Wooden batons, 18 inches long and weighted at one end. Handcuffs with chains short enough to prevent prisoners from using them as weapons. Flashlights heavy enough to double as clubs. Key rings that weighed 3 pounds when fully loaded, creating brass knuckles that left no fingerprints on bruised skin. The batons were officially called riot sticks, though riots were rare at Rikers. Their real purpose was more subtle, a psychological reminder of physical authority that guards carried on their belts like badges of office. The wood was seasoned oak, hard enough to crack ribs but light enough to swing quickly in confined spaces. Regulations required that each baton be inspected monthly for splinters or cracks that might indicate excessive use, but these inspections were performed by the same guards who wielded them, creating a system of oversight that saw nothing it didn't want to see. More important than the batons were the keys. Each guard carried between 15 and 30 keys on a ring attached to their belt by a retractable chain. Keys to cell doors, corridor gates, supply closets, administrative offices, and emergency exits. The weight of these keys marked the boundary between freedom and captivity. Those who carried them could move anywhere in the facility, while those who didn't remained locked in spaces barely large enough for a grown man to lie down. The key rings themselves became weapons of opportunity. 3 pounds of metal swung with the full force of an arm could shatter cheekbones or crack skulls. Unlike batons, keys left injuries that looked accidental, round bruises that could have come from falls, cuts that might have been caused by rough walls or sharp corners. The medical staff at Rikers learned to recognize keyring injuries, but they also learned not to ask too many questions about how those injuries occurred. Night guards discovered that keys made almost no sound when wrapped in electrical tape. Day guards found that key rings could be swung like medieval maces in the narrow corridors between cell blocks. Both shifts learned that inmates who complained about key ring beatings were often dismissed as liars by investigators who couldn't imagine that something so ordinary could be used with such deliberate cruelty. The scheduling system at Rikers was designed to prevent guards from forming stable partnerships that might develop into personal loyalties stronger than institutional loyalty. Shifts rotated every 6 weeks. Partners changed monthly. Days off were staggered to ensure that no two guards consistently worked the same schedule. The theory was that constant rotation would prevent corruption and favoritism among staff members. In practice, rotation created an environment where nobody took responsibility for anything. Guards working their first week on a new unit could claim ignorance about local problems. Supervisors rotating between shifts could attribute any issues to their predecessors. The constant shuffle meant that brutality became anonymous. Victims couldn't identify specific attackers, and witnesses couldn't be certain which guards they had seen using excessive force. Sleep deprivation affected everyone inside the walls. Prisoners were awakened at 5:30 for breakfast, whether they had slept or not. Evening lockdown came at 9 o'clock, but lights remained on in the corridors, creating a perpetual twilight that made real rest impossible. Guards working midnight shifts often dozed at their posts, while day guards dealt with inmates who had been awake for most of the night, their nerves frayed by exhaustion and confinement. The sleep schedule was officially designed for security. Regular counts prevented escapes, and early wake-ups reduced the time available for planning trouble. But exhaustion also served as a form of behavioral control. Tired people were easier to manage, less likely to resist orders, more compliant during searches and transfers. The prison ran on a rhythm of controlled fatigue that left everyone too drained to think clearly about what was happening around them. Medical records from this period show patterns that should have triggered investigations, but somehow never did. Emergency room visits spiked during the winter months, when shorter days and longer confinement periods increased tension throughout the facility. Injuries classified as accidental occurred most frequently during shift changes, when responsibility was unclear and supervision was minimal. Broken bones happened disproportionately in areas where security cameras had blind spots or mechanical problems. The most telling pattern was temporal. Serious injuries peaked between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning when skeleton crews supervised inmates who should have been asleep in locked cells. These were the hours when guards had maximum freedom and minimum oversight, when violence could happen in the darkness and be discovered only hours later, when the shift change occurred, and responsibility transferred to fresh guards who had no direct knowledge of overnight events. Dr. Patricia Hendricks worked as the night physician at Rikers from 1961 to 1967, treating everything from heart attacks to stab wounds during the hours when most of the city slept. Her medical notes, preserved in municipal archives, document a steady stream of injuries that defied explanation: facial fractures in prisoners who claimed to remember nothing about how they occurred, rib fractures in inmates found unconscious in their cells, concussions in men who insisted they had never fallen. Hendricks was not naive about prison violence. She understood that inmates fought each other, that guards sometimes used force to maintain order, that accidents happened in an environment full of concrete and steel, but the injuries she treated followed patterns that suggested something more systematic than random violence or occasional excessive force. The same guards' names appeared repeatedly in incident reports. The same locations generated suspicious injuries month after month. The same explanations were offered for different injuries sustained by different inmates in different circumstances. When Hendricks raised her concerns with the administration, she was told that her job was to treat injuries, not investigate their causes. When she documented patterns in her reports, she was reminded that medical records were confidential and that sharing them with outside agencies could violate patient privacy laws. When she requested additional security cameras in problem areas, she was informed that budget constraints made equipment upgrades impossible for the foreseeable future. The message was clear: treat the symptoms, ignore the disease, and remember that physicians who asked too many questions about prison operations might find their contracts terminated when they came up for renewal. Hendricks stayed until 1967, when she transferred to a hospital position that paid less money but demanded less silence. Her replacement was a recent medical school graduate who had never worked in corrections and who accepted the official explanations for suspicious injuries with the trust of someone who had never learned that institutions could lie. The stairwells at Rikers became legendary among both guards and inmates as places where the rules didn't apply. These were concrete chambers that connected the housing units, isolated from the main corridors and invisible to the security cameras that monitored common areas. Each stairwell contained 4 flights of steps, separated by narrow landings barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The acoustics amplified sound, but the heavy doors at each end muffled noise from reaching the outside corridors. Escorts through stairwells required a minimum of 2 guards, officially for security, but practically for mutual protection, not from inmates, but from accountability. With 2 guards present, any use of force could be justified as necessary and witnessed by a colleague. With 2 guards present, any injuries could be explained as accidental and confirmed by someone who had been there. With 2 guards present, solidarity could be maintained and questions could be answered with consistent stories that protected everyone involved. The geography of these stairwells created opportunities that guards learned to exploit. A prisoner could slip on the concrete steps. A prisoner could fall against the metal handrail. A prisoner could strike his head on the low ceiling where the stairs turned at each landing. These accidents explained contusions, lacerations, and fractures that might otherwise require more creative explanations from guards who wanted to avoid paperwork and investigations. Internal memos from the early 1960s refer to escort protocols that were never formally written into regulations, but were passed down through informal training among guards. New officers learned which stairwells offered the most privacy, which routes avoided areas with working cameras, and which explanations were most likely to be accepted by supervisors who didn't want to know too much about how order was maintained during their shifts. The most experienced guards developed a vocabulary of violence that described different techniques for different situations. A wall check meant slamming a prisoner's face into concrete until he understood who was in control. A stair lesson meant pushing someone down a flight of steps and claiming he had tripped. A handrail adjustment meant using the metal railing to strike pressure points that would cause maximum pain with minimal visible damage. These weren't official terms. They never appeared in training manuals or procedure guides. They were part of an oral tradition that preserved institutional knowledge about controlling prisoners through fear and pain. Veterans passed them to rookies during quiet moments between shifts, teaching not just the techniques, but the philosophy that made them seem necessary and justified. The philosophy was simple. Inmates were not citizens temporarily deprived of freedom, but enemies temporarily restrained by superior force. They would exploit any weakness, abuse any kindness, and interpret any mercy as an invitation to further misconduct. The only language they understood was violence, and the only lesson they remembered was pain. Guards who forgot this principle endangered themselves, their colleagues, and the order that kept the entire system from collapsing into chaos. This worldview transformed ordinary men into instruments of systematic brutality. It provided moral justification for actions that would be considered torture in any other context. It created a culture where compassion was seen as dangerous naivety and where violence was seen as professional competence. Most importantly, it made brutality seem not just acceptable, but necessary, the only rational response to an irrational situation. The key ring became the signature weapon of this culture, not because it was the most effective tool for inflicting pain, but because it was the most available. Every guard carried keys. Every escort required keys. Every cell check, every corridor patrol, every routine interaction involved the sound of metal on metal that reminded everyone present about the fundamental relationship between those who unlocked doors and those who waited behind them. Medical staff learned to recognize the distinctive bruising pattern left by key rings, circular marks surrounded by radiating impact lines that looked like tiny suns. These injuries were almost never attributed to guard violence in official reports. Instead, they were described as blunt force trauma of unknown origin, or contusions consistent with accidental impact against cell fixtures. The euphemistic language served multiple purposes. It protected guards from criminal prosecution by avoiding direct accusations of assault. It protected the administration from civil liability by maintaining plausible deniability about systematic abuse. And it protected the system itself by creating documentation that told a story of unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate cruelty. But the euphemisms also served a psychological purpose for the people who used them. Language shapes thought, and thought shapes behavior. Guards who never admitted to themselves that they were torturing prisoners could maintain their self-image as professionals doing a difficult job under impossible circumstances. Supervisors who never acknowledged systematic brutality could sleep at night believing they ran an institution that operated according to legal and ethical standards. The silence that surrounded these practices was not imposed by any formal conspiracy or explicit orders. It emerged naturally from the shared understanding that survival, financial, professional, and physical, depended on maintaining solidarity with colleagues regardless of what those colleagues might do. Guards who reported excessive force by other guards found themselves isolated, transferred to undesirable assignments, or subjected to the same violence they had tried to expose. This code of silence was reinforced by the union that represented corrections officers, which treated any investigation of guard misconduct as an attack on all guards. Legal representation was provided for officers accused of brutality. Character witnesses testified about their professionalism and dedication. Defense strategies focused on the dangerous nature of prison work and the split-second decisions that guards had to make when their safety was threatened by unpredictable inmates. The union's protection created a moral hazard that encouraged exactly the kind of behavior it claimed to defend against. Guards knew that they were more likely to face consequences for failing to support a colleague accused of misconduct than for engaging in misconduct themselves. The incentive structure rewarded loyalty over honesty, solidarity over justice, and silence over truth. By the late 1960s, this culture had become self-perpetuating. New guards were selected partially based on their willingness to fit into existing practices. Training emphasized the importance of backing up fellow officers in any situation. Promotion depended on demonstrating the kind of leadership that maintained order without generating complaints or investigations. The result was an institution that functioned according to rules that were never written down, enforced through methods that were never officially acknowledged, and justified by a philosophy that treated human beings as something less than human. The concrete and steel created the physical structure that contained bodies, but the culture created the moral structure that contained conscience, empathy, and the basic recognition that violence against defenseless people is wrong regardless of what those people might have done to deserve imprisonment. The machine was complete. It had learned to run itself, to protect itself, and to reproduce itself through new generations of guards who inherited not just the keys and batons and techniques, but the worldview that made brutality seem like common sense and cruelty seem like compassion. What they had built at Rikers was not just a jail, but a training ground for the kind of institutional violence that would spread through American corrections like a virus, infecting everyone it touched and leaving scars that would never fully heal. The population of Rikers Island doubled between 1965 and 1970, from 8,000 inmates to over 16,000, while the number of guards increased by only 30%. The mathematics of this disparity were simple but catastrophic. Fewer guards supervising more prisoners in the same cramped spaces, with the same inadequate facilities, using the same brutal methods that had barely maintained order when the odds were less overwhelming. The additional inmates didn't arrive gradually. They came in waves that corresponded to changes in criminal justice policy, drug enforcement priorities, and social upheaval in the streets of New York. The summer of 1967 brought hundreds of arrests during racial unrest in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Harlem. The winter of 1968 filled the cells with anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, and ordinary criminals swept up in aggressive policing campaigns designed to restore order to a city that seemed to be spinning out of control. Each surge in population required improvisation that became permanent policy. Double bunking in cells designed for single occupancy, triple shifts for guards who were already working overtime, meal schedules that allowed 15 minutes per person for food that was barely edible when hot and inedible when cold. Recreation periods cut from 1 hour to 30 minutes, then to 15 minutes, then canceled entirely when the yard became too dangerous to supervise with available staff. The overcrowding affected every aspect of daily life inside the walls, but most importantly, it affected the psychology of control. Guards who had maintained order through the implied threat of violence now found themselves outnumbered by ratios that made that threat meaningless unless it was carried out frequently and with sufficient brutality to serve as an example for everyone watching. The calculus of fear required regular demonstrations that the consequences of resistance were worse than the misery of compliance. Medical records from this period show injury rates that should have triggered federal intervention, but federal attention was focused on riots in other cities and wars on other continents. Broken bones increased by 40% between 1968 and 1970. Emergency hospitalizations doubled. Deaths in custody rose from 2 per year to 8 per year, though most were classified as suicides or accidents rather than homicides. The suicide classification was particularly convenient because it required no investigation of guard conduct and implied that inmates were responsible for their own deaths. Men were found hanging in cells where bedsheets had supposedly been tied to fixtures that engineering reports later showed couldn't support the weight of a human body. Others were discovered with skull fractures that allegedly resulted from falls in shower areas where the floor was level concrete with no obstacles to trip over. Dr. Michael Brennan, who served as chief medical officer from 1969 to 1974, later described the challenge of providing health care in an environment where injuries were systematically misrepresented and where accurate diagnosis could implicate colleagues in criminal conduct. Prisoners arrived at the infirmary with stories that contradicted their wounds. Guards provided explanations that contradicted the medical evidence. Supervisors demanded documentation that supported the official version of events regardless of what actually happened. Brennan learned to practice a form of medicine that would have been considered malpractice in any other setting. He treated fractures without asking how bones had been broken. He stitched lacerations without inquiring about the objects that had caused them. He prescribed pain medication for injuries that he couldn't officially acknowledge existed, using diagnostic codes that described symptoms without identifying causes. The pressure to participate in this systematic deception came not just from corrections officials, but from his own medical staff. Nurses who asked too many questions found their shifts reassigned. Technicians who documented suspicious injuries too carefully were transferred to other facilities. The message was clear. Healthcare workers who wanted to keep their jobs would focus on treating patients, not investigating crimes. This corruption of medical ethics had consequences that extended beyond individual cases of abuse. Accurate injury data was essential for identifying patterns of violence, holding perpetrators accountable, and preventing future incidents. When medical records systematically misrepresented the causes of injuries, they became tools for concealing rather than revealing the truth about what was happening inside the walls. The deliberate falsification of medical records was not technically illegal, since doctors were not required to speculate about the causes of injuries when those causes were disputed by patients and witnesses. But it represented a fundamental betrayal of the physician's oath to, first, do no harm. By participating in cover-ups of systematic abuse, medical staff became accomplices to the violence they were supposedly treating. The shower rooms at Rikers were redesigned in 1969 following a riot that left 12 inmates hospitalized and 6 guards with injuries serious enough to require surgery. The new design featured individual stalls rather than communal areas, improved drainage to prevent slipping, and emergency buttons that inmates could press to summon help if they were attacked by other prisoners. The emergency buttons were never connected to the central alarm system. Engineering documents show that the wiring was installed but never completed, leaving inmates with the illusion of protection but no actual means of summoning assistance. Guards discovered that the shower stalls created perfect isolation chambers where violence could be inflicted without witnesses or interference. The improved drainage meant that blood washed away quickly, leaving no physical evidence of what had occurred. Individual shower stalls also solved a logistical problem that had long frustrated guards who wanted to discipline inmates without being observed by other prisoners. Communal showers meant that any use of force would be witnessed by multiple people who could later testify about what they had seen. Individual stalls meant that guards could isolate specific inmates and deal with them privately, knowing that any claims of abuse would be unsupported by eyewitness testimony. The acoustic design of the new shower areas amplified screams but muffled them, creating a sound that could be heard throughout the housing unit but couldn't be clearly identified or located. Inmates learned to recognize the particular echo that meant someone was being beaten in the showers, but they also learned not to react to those sounds in any way that might identify them as witnesses to whatever was happening behind the steel doors. The shower schedule became a form of administrative punishment that could be imposed without formal disciplinary proceedings. Inmates who filed complaints, spoke to lawyers, or otherwise caused problems for the administration found themselves assigned to shower periods, when they would be alone with guards who had been specifically instructed to orient them about the consequences of challenging authority. These orientation sessions followed patterns that were never written down, but were consistently applied throughout the facility. The first beating was always delivered without explanation, leaving the victim uncertain about what he had done wrong or how he could avoid future punishment. The second beating came with a clear message about the behavior that needed to change. The third beating was administered with maximum brutality, as a demonstration that the guard's patience had been exhausted. This escalating violence served multiple purposes. It gave inmates opportunities to modify their behavior before suffering permanent injury. It provided guards with plausible justification for increasingly severe force. And it created a learning curve that taught prisoners how to survive in an environment where the official rules were meaningless and the real rules were enforced through pain. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the shower beatings was their unpredictability. Inmates never knew when they might be selected for discipline or what they might have done to trigger retaliation. The uncertainty created constant anxiety that was more effective than any specific punishment, because it meant that everyone was always afraid of being next, always monitoring their own behavior for infractions they might not even recognize as problematic. Guards learned to use this fear as a management tool that required minimal physical violence but maximum psychological impact. The threat of the showers was more powerful than the reality of the showers, because the threat affected everyone while the reality affected only those who were unlucky enough to be chosen as examples for the others. The union that represented corrections officers at Rikers was Local 237 of the Teamsters, an organization that had experience protecting workers in industries where violence was common and oversight was minimal. The union's approach to defending guards accused of excessive force was sophisticated, well-funded, and remarkably effective at preventing criminal prosecutions or civil lawsuits from succeeding. The first line of defense was always delay. Union lawyers filed motions that postponed hearings, requested additional time to review evidence, and demanded access to information that took months to compile. Each delay gave memories time to fade, witnesses time to reconsider their testimony, and complainants time to lose interest in pursuing cases that seemed increasingly unlikely to succeed. The second line of defense was character assassination. Union investigators dug into the backgrounds of inmates who filed complaints, looking for criminal histories, mental health issues, or drug problems that could be used to undermine their credibility. Defense attorneys presented this information not as evidence that the complaints were false, but as evidence that the complainants were unreliable witnesses whose testimony couldn't be trusted. The third line of defense was professional solidarity. When guards were accused of misconduct, their colleagues rallied around them with testimony about their dedication, professionalism, and the dangerous conditions they faced every day. Character witnesses described the accused officers as devoted family men who would never harm anyone unnecessarily, while expert witnesses explained the split-second decisions that corrections officers had to make when their safety was threatened. This defense strategy was effective because it transformed every case from a question about what had happened to a question about who should be believed. Guards were portrayed as public servants who risked their lives to protect society from dangerous criminals. Inmates were portrayed as manipulative liars who would say anything to get attention, sympathy, or financial compensation for their own criminal behavior. The Union also provided financial support that went far beyond legal representation. Guards facing accusations received full pay during investigations, regardless of how long those investigations lasted. Their families received counseling services to help them cope with the stress of public scrutiny. Their medical expenses were covered if they claimed that the allegations had caused anxiety, depression, or other stress-related health problems. This financial protection created incentives that encouraged guards to maintain solidarity with colleagues accused of misconduct. Supporting a fellow officer meant maintaining access to the same benefits if you ever faced similar accusations. Cooperating with investigators meant risking isolation, harassment, and loss of Union protection when you needed it most. The result was an institution that had become accountable only to itself, protected by a legal and political structure that made meaningful oversight almost impossible. Guards who committed acts that would be considered felony assault on the street could count on Union protection, legal representation, and character witnesses who would portray them as heroes rather than criminals. By 1970, the population at Rikers had reached levels that made traditional corrections management impossible. The facility was operating at more than double its designed capacity, with inmates sleeping on floors, sharing cells intended for one person, and competing for resources that were already inadequate when the jail held half as many people. The response from city officials was to blame the inmates themselves for the problems created by overcrowding. Public statements described Rikers as housing the most dangerous criminals in New York, though most inmates were awaiting trial for nonviolent crimes or serving short sentences for minor offenses. The rhetoric of danger justified the reality of brutality, making it seem reasonable that guards would need to use extraordinary force to maintain order among extraordinarily dangerous prisoners. This narrative was effective because it allowed everyone involved to avoid confronting the real causes of violence at Rikers. Officials could blame criminal inmates rather than institutional failures. Guards could blame dangerous working conditions rather than their own behavior. The public could blame crime in general rather than specific policies that created the overcrowding and understaffing that made violence inevitable. The machine had learned to protect itself by making its failures appear to be successes, its cruelty appear to be necessity, and its victims appear to be perpetrators. What they had built at Rikers was not just a jail, but a system that could justify any level of brutality by pointing to the inherent dangerousness of the people being brutalized. The foundation was complete. The walls were in place. The culture was established. All that remained was for time and pressure to do their work, grinding human beings against concrete and steel until something broke, and it would not be the concrete and steel. The morning of March 15, 1971 brought with it the kind of silence that comes before natural disasters. The guards noticed it first, a quietness in the corridors that was different from ordinary institutional calm. No shuffling feet, no muffled conversations through cell doors, no coughing or snoring, or the thousand small sounds that mark human presence in confined spaces. The first shift change of the day passed without incident. Head counts came back correct. Breakfast was served and consumed without disturbance. But something had shifted in the air. Something that experienced guards could feel in their bones without being able to name or document in their reports. What they were sensing was the approach of exposure, the moment when secrets that had been carefully maintained for decades would suddenly become public knowledge, when violence that had been invisible would become undeniable, when the machine they had built would finally break down under the weight of its own contradictions. The breaking point began with a single photograph. A Polaroid image taken in secret by a medical technician who had grown tired of treating injuries that could never be officially acknowledged. The photograph showed a man's back covered with welts that formed a perfect grid pattern, the unmistakable signature of a beating administered with a metal object across bare skin. The technician had violated every protocol by taking the picture. Photography of inmates was strictly forbidden except for identification purposes. Medical records were confidential. Evidence of guard misconduct was supposed to be reported through official channels, not documented secretly and smuggled off the island. But the technician had reached a point where following protocol meant participating in a lie that had grown too big to bear. The photograph made its way to a civil rights attorney named Maria Santos, who had been representing inmates at Rikers for 3 years without success. Every brutality complaint she filed was dismissed as unfounded. Every medical record she requested was either heavily redacted or had mysteriously disappeared. Every witness she tried to interview either recanted their statements or refused to speak at all. But the photograph was different. It provided objective evidence that couldn't be explained away as the fabrication of disgruntled inmates or the misunderstanding of inexperienced observers. The grid pattern on the man's back told a story that no amount of administrative double talk could rewrite. Someone had been tortured in a New York City jail, and the injuries had been photographed by medical personnel who were supposedly treating him. Santos filed a federal lawsuit that included the photograph as evidence. The Department of Corrections' initial response was predictable. They claimed the image had been fabricated, that the injuries shown were inconsistent with any incident documented in their records, and that the lawsuit was part of a campaign to undermine public safety by criminals seeking financial compensation for their own bad behavior. But the photograph had already begun its journey through the media ecosystem that surrounded New York's courts. Copies were made. Journalists were contacted. Expert witnesses examined the image and confirmed that the injuries were real, recent, and could only have been inflicted by repeated strikes with a rigid object approximately 2 inches wide. The grid pattern became a signature that couldn't be denied. More photographs surfaced, taken secretly by other medical workers who had been quietly documenting evidence of systematic abuse. Prison records were subpoenaed and analyzed by forensic accountants who found patterns of medical expenses, overtime payments, and equipment purchases that supported claims of widespread violence. The investigation expanded beyond individual cases of brutality to examine the institutional structures that had made such violence possible. Federal prosecutors discovered that guards accused of excessive force were routinely transferred rather than terminated, allowing them to continue their careers at other facilities. They found evidence that medical records had been systematically altered to conceal injuries. They uncovered financial records showing that the city had budgeted for settlement payments as a regular line item, essentially treating brutality lawsuits as an expected cost of doing business. Most damning was the discovery of internal memos dating back to the 1960s that showed administrators were aware of widespread abuse but had chosen to address it through public relations management rather than policy reform. One memo, written by a deputy commissioner, explicitly stated that isolated incidents of excessive force were less expensive to settle than the personnel and infrastructure changes that would be required to prevent them. The federal investigation revealed a culture of violence that extended far beyond individual guard misconduct. It exposed an institution that had systematically prioritized order over humanity, efficiency over dignity, and silence over justice. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the brutality at Rikers was not the result of a few bad guards or isolated incidents of poor judgment, but the predictable outcome of policies that treated prisoners as something less than human. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the violence had been normalized throughout the correction system. Guards who transferred from Rikers to other facilities brought with them the techniques and attitudes they had learned on the island. Supervisors who were promoted to run other jails implemented the same policies that had proved effective at maintaining order through fear and intimidation. The culture of brutality had metastasized beyond the waters that surrounded Rikers Island. It had spread through the entire New York correction system like a virus, infecting everyone it touched and reproducing itself in new environments where oversight was weak and accountability was non-existent. But even as federal investigators documented decades of systematic abuse, the machine continued to operate. Guards reported to work each day. Inmates were processed through intake. Meals were served. Lights went out at the appointed hour. The investigation was treated as an external annoyance, rather than an internal crisis, something to be managed by lawyers and public relations specialists, rather than addressed through fundamental reform. The first consent decree was signed in 1974, requiring the Department of Correction to implement sweeping changes in training, supervision, medical care, and disciplinary procedures. The document was 68 pages long and included specific requirements for everything from guard-to-inmate ratios to bathroom maintenance schedules. The consent decree looked impressive on paper. It mandated additional staff training on the appropriate use of force. It required medical examinations for all inmates reporting injuries. It established independent oversight mechanisms to investigate complaints of guard misconduct. It created new procedures for disciplinary hearings that included representation for accused inmates. But the consent decree also contained loopholes large enough to drive a corrections van through. Training requirements could be satisfied with classroom instruction that never addressed real-world situations. Medical examinations could be performed by doctors who had been instructed not to ask too many questions about suspicious injuries. Oversight mechanisms could be staffed by investigators who understood that too much diligence might jeopardize their continued employment. Most importantly, the consent decree did nothing to change the fundamental economic incentives that had created the culture of violence in the first place. Guards who used excessive force still enjoyed union protection. Supervisors who tolerated abuse still received promotions. Administrators who covered up scandals still kept their jobs and pensions. The reforms looked substantial from the outside, but felt cosmetic from the inside. New policies were written, but old practices continued. Additional oversight was implemented, but the overseers were chosen by the same people who had presided over the abuses. Training programs were expanded, but the trainers were veteran guards, who taught new recruits the same unofficial rules that had governed the island for decades. The violence didn't stop. It just became more careful. Guards learned to avoid leaving marks that would photograph well. Medical staff learned to document injuries in language that wouldn't attract attention from investigators. Administrators learned to respond to complaints with investigations that followed proper procedures but reached predetermined conclusions. The consent decree created the illusion of reform while preserving the substance of the status quo. It allowed officials to claim that they had addressed the problems revealed by the federal investigation while maintaining the institutional culture that had created those problems. Most importantly, it provided legal cover for continuing practices that had been rebranded as reformed but not fundamentally changed. By 1975, the population at Rikers had grown to over 18,000 inmates, making it larger than many American cities. The federal investigation had attracted national attention to conditions on the island, but it had also attracted additional funding that allowed the Department of Correction to expand facilities rather than improve them. New housing units were constructed using the same design principles that had created problems in the existing buildings. More guards were hired, but they were trained by the same supervisors who had overseen the abuses documented by federal investigators. Additional medical staff were brought in, but they worked under the same administrators who had presided over the systematic falsification of medical records. The machine had learned to grow while appearing to reform, to expand while seeming to improve. Each new building represented not progress but replication, the reproduction of failed systems on a larger scale. Each additional guard represented not improvement, but multiplication. More people trained in the same methods that had produced decades of systematic abuse. The island had become something unprecedented in American corrections, a city-sized institution that operated according to its own laws, enforced its own justice, and maintained its own silence. It was too big to close, too profitable to abandon, and too entrenched to reform. It had achieved a kind of institutional immortality that would outlive every politician who had created it, every administrator who had run it, and every guard who had worked there. What they had built was not just a jail, but a machine for reproducing itself, a system that could survive investigations, outlast reforms, and continue operating regardless of the human cost. The concrete and steel were just the beginning. The real architecture was cultural, psychological, and economic. Structures that were invisible but indestructible. foundations that were built not in the ground but in the mind. By the end of the 1970s, Rikers Island had become what its original designers could never have imagined. Not a solution to the problem of criminal justice, but a permanent feature of New York's landscape, as enduring as the bridges that connected it to the mainland and as inescapable as the water that surrounded it. The machine was complete. It had learned to feed itself, protect itself, and reproduce itself. All that remained was time. Decades of time for the consequences to compound, for the trauma to spread, for the costs to accumulate, and for a city to discover that some problems can't be solved by building walls around them. The morning shift change on December 3, 1979, marked exactly 44 years of continuous operation at Rikers Island. The guards who clocked in that day were sons of men who had worked the same corridors, inheritors of a tradition that passed from father to son like a family business built on human misery. The silence that morning was different from the ordinary quiet of institutional routine. It was the silence of exhaustion, of systems pushed beyond their breaking point, of people who had stopped believing that anything they did mattered because the machine was so much larger than any individual conscience. It was the silence that comes when everyone knows that something is wrong, but no one knows how to make it right. What they didn't know was that the machine had already begun to break down, not from outside pressure, but from internal contradictions that had been building pressure for decades. The violence that had been used to maintain control was creating exactly the kind of chaos it was supposed to prevent. The fear that had been used to ensure compliance was generating the kind of desperation that made people willing to risk everything for any chance at freedom. The breakdown, when it came, would not be gradual or manageable. It would be sudden, spectacular, and irreversible. And when the smoke cleared, everyone would ask the same question that should have been asked 44 years earlier. What did we think would happen when we built a machine for destroying human beings and expected it not to destroy us too? The machine was about to prove that it had been teaching everyone all along: guards, inmates, administrators, politicians, and citizens. The lesson was simple. Violence is a language that everyone speaks fluently once they've learned the grammar. And Rikers Island had been conducting a master class in that grammar for nearly half a century. The final exam was about to begin.